So I'm Gordon McFarlane, PPMA board member and Director of HR and OD in Newham. And I'll facilitate the session today, which means hopefully I won't say very much for a little while. Just a couple of kind of hygiene bits before we start. So this is the latest in a series of webinars. So thank you all for joining. We're recording it, so the recording will be available afterwards. So if you have colleagues who haven't managed to join, they'll be able to watch the webinar afterwards. It's going on for an hour today. For those who've been on previous webinars, they're normally half an hour. This one we're giving an hour to, so just so that people are aware of that as we start. I think the best thing to do is, if there are questions and comments, if you can put those in the chat as we go, so the presenters can kind of work through their presentation. We will build time in for something that's a bit more interactive, and we can either get people talking or I can pick up some of the comments from the chat after the presentation. And we will aim to finish by 1 o'clock. So creating a thriving culture at pace. It's an interesting and popular one, I think. Let me hand over initially to Juliette and presenters to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm Juliette Alban-Metcalfe. I'm a psychologist by background, and I'm Chief Exec of Real World Group.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm Kate Enver, and I'm the Corporate Head of HR, Comms and OD at Runnymede Borough Council in Surrey.
So shall I crack on then, Gordon?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll leave it to you to share slides and we'll get going.
Great. So I will first of all, are we currently sharing slides? Can I just check?
I can't see them yet.
Okay, right. I'll just start sharing slides then. Should come up any second now.
I can see them.
You can see
them.
them.
Hang on, they might be on my other screen. They are on my other screen. That's all right. We're using Zoom, not Teams.
Can everyone
Apologies.
Still see the slides?
Just
I haven't unshared them by accident. Can you all still see the slides okay?
I think we're there. Sorry, my fault.
No problem at all. So great. So we're really looking forward to talking to everybody today about the journey that Runnymede Borough Council went on through the guidance of the fantastic Kate, who you'll really enjoy hearing from. We supported the programme through facilitating conversation, through facilitating workshops, by providing coaching, and also providing assessments that helped Runnymede to understand really what was going on, what was brilliant to build on, what the challenges were. But absolutely, it was about enabling the great leaders at Runnymede to work their way through the best value notice and out of it. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing it again from Kate about the fantastic work that she led on. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with Kate explaining some context about Runnymede. Then I'll take over and I'll explain about the mechanics of the programme that helped to facilitate this journey. And then we'll go back to Kate and she'll talk to you about the outcome of the work that we did together and what next for Runnymede. So handing over to you, Kate, to talk about the context.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be with you here today. Juliette, can you change the slides because I'm clicking and nothing's back. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I joined Runnymede about 18 months ago. I started on the 8th of January and we had been issued with a best value notice on the 19th of December. So the job I actually took and the job I started in was slightly different. And it was an interesting time to join the organisation. Runnymede has a population of 88,000, covers 30 square miles. We're a district council. And as you can see, we have a thriving economic community within the borough. Our GVA is second highest to London in the country at 14.5%. So We also have the largest growing LGBTQ plus community within Surrey. And as you can see, we've got low crime rates. 80% of the population are considered economically active. So I'm going to think, oh, there are no problems here. What is your challenge? Why are MHCLG concerned about us? Well, in about 10, 15 years ago, there was a real push from central government at the time around trying to be more commercial and take more risks. And Runnymede embraced that hook, line and sinker, and really bought a lot of property and borrowed the money to buy a lot of property. That sum comes to around 650 million. And the MHCLG were quite concerned about our loan to return ratios, hence why we were issued with our best value notice. There does come a lot of benefits for the borough from taking that approach, that commercial approach, in that we generate an income of between 11 and 13 million pounds from the property portfolio that we have. So it allows us to continue to provide some of the community services that otherwise you wouldn't see happen in the borough, and has really been beneficial to our residents and communities with regeneration programmes alike. However, the MHCLG wanted us to assure them that the loan to debt ratio could be managed, and that the council was managing that appropriately and adequately, both in terms of political leadership and officer competence and capability. Next slide, Juliette. Okay.
By clicking now.
Yeah, just click through them, that's fine, thank you. So the key to that was the effectiveness and efficiency of internal decision making and the scrutiny process. Culture and leadership, including the authority's sense of strategic vision and direction, effectiveness of leadership, attitudes and behaviours. And they were really interested in capacity and capability for continuous improvement, and what the appetite in the organisation was like for that, and how we could demonstrate that we were up for the challenge from them, and how we were going to, and what our response was in terms of our approach to demonstrating that. Were we saying there's nothing to see here and defending our position wholeheartedly, or were we saying, actually, we're welcoming you in, we'll show you what we're doing, we think we're doing the right thing, what do you think? And that went right down to them reviewing delivery of services and how we were actually operating, particularly in areas such as assets and regeneration and the management of our property portfolio. Now, this is where Juliette will take us to the next slides, but this is where we really came into our own, because as I said, I started on the 8th of January and we had our first meeting with the MHCLG on the 10th of January. And whilst they were going through the figures and looking at the SIPFA reports and nodding at the calculations that have been provided around the finances and the financial security, one lady in particular from our panel of representatives from MHCLG turned to us and said, and this is all very well and good, but clearly the hardest part is the evidence of the culture piece. So how are you going to do that? And the whole room looked at me and I said, well, it's lovely to be here. This is day 2 for me. And I've got some thoughts and ideas that I'd like to take you through. So in terms of that agile thinking that all HR professionals are encouraged to develop, when that came out in volumes in that first discussion. And the key for me was to look at how we could demonstrate to the MHCLG and also the LGA in terms of their peer review, because that was part and parcel of being taken through the BVM process, was to really demonstrate that we understood how we were perceived and that we understood what we were seeing when we looked in the mirror, and that we could demonstrate that we knew ourselves, and therefore, because we knew ourselves, we were able to identify the gaps that we knew we had, and we were able to demonstrate how we were actually going to address those gaps, and how actually we'd started some of the work that was in train and where we intended to go for the future. And that was the key part as to where I picked up the phone and rang Juliette and said, is there a way in which you can help us with that? Because the tools that the Real World group supported us with actually really helped to be able to evidence that we'd invited external kind of scrutiny in to check and challenge how we were behaving, whether or not we truly understood what those political and officer relationships with our frontline staff groups were like, and what we were doing to improve them for the benefit of the organisation, of the managerial finances, and delivery for our residents and communities. And that was really, really key for us. So I think at this point, Juliette, is where I will hand back to you.
Thank you, Kate. So what I'll do now is I'll take you through the activity that we designed for Runnymede and the programme that we ran with them, working alongside Kate. So those of you who know Real World Group, we've been active with the PPMA for a number of years, and we're really proud and thrilled about our relationship with PPMA. So you've probably heard of us before, but if you haven't, we've been around for 25 years. And what we do is we conduct research into what creates high performance in organisations, and then we apply it through tools and techniques and assessments to enable organisations to build capacity, and exactly the sorts of ways that Kate's talked about just now. And so what we did was, using our experience over the last 25 years, we put together a powerful programme to help Runnymede to move beyond the best value notice and to be absolutely thriving. There was two parts to the programme. So the first part was the work that we did with CLT and SLT specifically. So I'll talk you through that in the different stages. The first thing that we did was we absolutely wanted to make sure that we weren't coming in and saying, right, well, let's help you fix things our way. We wanted to start by finding out what did the members of CLT and SLT feel were the things that really, needed to be addressed in Runnymede in order to satisfy the best value notice and move together more strongly, but also what did they think were the things that were working well already. So what were the strengths and what were the weaknesses of the leadership culture, particularly at the top of the organisation, that from their perspective. So we started by that, and we wanted to get their buy-in around what do they think would be the best ways of addressing. We then we fed that back to them in terms of theme, so they then had a better understanding of how each other felt. Because of course, far too often in an incredibly busy and fast-paced world, just a digital age, but never mind that, add onto that the complexity of local government and the incredible pressures that you're facing. And no one has time, typically, to discuss things in the depth that is needed because there's so much day-to-day to do to keep meeting the needs of residents. So we were creating some space for them to really have those open and honest conversations about how they saw things. So in a leadership event, we brought them together and we talked about not only what they felt were the key things, but also updated them in terms of what other organisations do to be successful. What's the evidence around what are the things that they need to be focusing on day to day in order to create the conditions that they can do the right kind of delivery to make sure that they are devolving leadership capability and power and responsibility appropriately so that they are maximising the potential of the organisation. So that's what the leadership event was about. It was about helping them to understand, sort of refreshing leaders on what's the latest thinking and what's worked really well in other organisations. What did they say? What were the things about what they said? And then the third bit was we created the opportunity for them to envisage what the culture would ideally look like when they move out of and beyond the best value notice. So we used some appreciative inquiry to help people to really think about how wonderful things can be because we know that they've been great in the past. How can we build that into the future? The next stage was for CLT and SLT to undertake a Team 360 tool. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, because it's quite a unique approach in terms of developing leaders and leadership culture. But what was really critical, of course, was that while it's important they build this vision of where they want to go and how they want to get there, but they then need to understand, so what do other people think about how they're leading? What suggestions do other people have for how they can lead even better? What do people think they do well? What do people think they need to particularly focus on to get stronger? So that's a team perspective. And then the next thing, of course, is then what role can individual leaders play in strengthening the leadership culture of the organisation in the direction necessary? So Team 360 was a first stage, Individual 360 was a second stage, and we also ran a series of leadership workshops for all of this to come together and to be made sense of and to be translated from learning into action plans. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. The next part of the activity was gathering the perspectives of the wider organisation. So what we did was we created a survey which we call the My Experience Matters survey. And what this assesses is it assesses the leadership culture specifically. So you'll know from your experience that whenever you run an engagement survey or a staff attitude survey or something of that type, 99 times out of 100, I'm kind of tempted to say 100 times out of 100 based on my experience over the last 20 odd years, leadership is an issue that emerges from that survey, or if you do it from focus groups or whatever it is. And so what we've been designing over the years is these what are called leadership culture surveys, which enable organizations to do a really, really deep dive specifically about leadership culture. So it's not looking at things like, your terms and conditions and ways of working specifically. It's looking at how do people experience their line manager on a day-to-day basis, and how do they experience senior managers? Now, those of you who've come from, working in larger organizations and Runnymede, you might think, well, how does this apply to a large organization? But I should say that a lot of the culture change work we've led on with organizations has been very, very large organizations, and it's still the same thing. So I was talking to one the other day, and they were sort of saying, but the thing about senior leadership in our organization is that that people don't necessarily know who the senior leaders are, don't necessarily then have a sense of them. But the bottom line is that we know from, both research and practice, is that people don't need to know who the senior leaders are in an organisation to feel the impact of them. The decisions that are made behind closed doors, the decisions that are consultative or not consultative, the behaviours that senior leaders think are visible or invisible, all of those things have an impact. So we wanted to help the senior leaders in Runnymede to understand that the impact they were having, whether or not they felt that it was directly affecting other people. So asking about line managers and senior leaders. We then ran some series of feedback workshops, which enabled people to make sense of the data that emerged from the survey, but in their context. And then also, so basically people were invited all the way through. What we do is we invite people to make sense of the data, rather than sort of saying, well, this is great, so don't worry about it, and this needs fixing, so you must address this. We share the data and we facilitate it in a way that enables people to come to their own conclusions about what matters, because what's critical, of course, is context. So that's what those feedback workshops were about, people owning the data themselves. We then upskilled a large group of volunteers from across the organisation in all different types of directorate and department, not just HR and OD, to learn to use appreciative inquiry as a way of running focus groups, to really explore the best of what exists or what they've seen in the past, so that they can address key issues, whether it's things like staff morale, whether it's like, managers reducing or increasing job-related stress, whether it's career development opportunities, or whether it's issues related to groups marginalised in one way or another. But that is a really powerful way of moving forward, and that's what Runnymede adopted as well. So just to give you a sense of then what was the underpinning philosophy, what of course we know about organisations and how you maximise potential is that all of us have a vision of what thriving looks like in our organisations, And we all know that, that success comes from people with their knowledge, skills, abilities, their competencies, their experience and their potential, using the resources at their disposal. So resources being things like time and money and equipment and strategies and training and everything in between. So people applying resources is what leads to organizations either thriving or performing in okay or languishing. But it comes down to those two things, whether it's an entirely people-driven organization or whether it's an organization that's populated very much by IT, computers, machines, or whatever it is. And what's critical, of course, is understanding that you could have the same level of same level of resources, the same type of people in two different teams, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that they perform the same. They could perform very differently with the same type of people, same type of resources. And that's because, of course, something happens between the input and the output that either maximizes or multiplies potential performance, or it can reduce potential performance. And those things, of course, we all know as HR and OD people, are how engaged people are in their team or department, how motivated they are, their levels of commitment to their job, to the organisation, their levels of well-being, their fulfilment, their satisfaction, all those critical things. And so what we have been researching for the last 25 years and now in a hybrid context, and what is critical to that culture is what are the day-to-day leadership behaviours, not the grand gestures and this, all those kind of those things, but the day-to-day leadership behaviours are the things that create the right culture that enable organisations to thrive. So with the individual 360, people were able to reflect on how much they were enacting those behaviours day to day, or not, as the case may be. But critically, of course, we have to understand the organisational culture too. So in two ways, the My Experience Matters survey was helping Runnymede to understand the wider culture, the wider leadership culture in the organisation. And through both individual and Team 360, the senior managers in particular, CLT and SLT, were able to understand better their critical role in influencing the culture that then leads on to whether or not you get the leadership behaviours that you need. So it was about their recognition, and they absolutely did recognise this, that they had the most powerful impact on the culture, and so enabling them to really reflect on their behaviour. The tool that they completed specifically assessed these 8 dimensions that you can see in that diagram. And this approach is a genuine Team 360. So it's not about inviting people to sort of self-assess or even doing individual 360s and then collating them into one. It's a Team 360 that starts at the level of the team. So the reviewers that completed this were assessing either CLT as a whole, or they were assessing SLT as a whole, but without the CLT element, because the structure in Runnymede is one where CLT is part of SLT, but they were assessed separately for the purposes of this exercise so that each group could understand how they were perceived. But individuals on the teams were assessing the team as a whole, and reviewers, like for example, elected members, for example, partners, and of course each other as teams were assessing the teams as a whole. And there were 3 things that they got feedback on. The first one was how engaging their leadership behaviours were, so how much they were developing and maximising the capacity of the wider organisation. Essential governance competencies, so with the clarity of objectives, people being held to account, do people understand what their role is and how it links to the bigger picture? How is risk managed, and how is it enabled to not get in the way of people's innovation? And then the third aspect was around high-performing team behaviours. So is this just a group of people that are competent as individuals, or are they actually working as a team? So those are 3 areas that it assessed, and it also gave feedback in terms of what's the impact of those executives in the corporate leadership team and the senior leadership team on others. So particularly the direct reports, but also on each other. What was the impact they're having on each other? And to what extent do they increase or decrease the confidence that external stakeholders have in them and their desire to work with them? And we tailored it to Runnymede and their specific needs, as is critical. Although those 8 areas that you're looking at now, they are strongly evidence-based. So we didn't make significant changes, we just tailored it. I'm just explaining, the name of the tool is the Executive Team 360, but of course we created a CLT and an SLT version for Runnymede. But this just explains what I was talking about just now, in terms of that people are giving feedback to the team in question as a team rather than as individuals. So that was the first tool, and that was the first bit of feedback that CLT and SLT got, was how they're perceived as a team. Then each individual committed to undertake individual 360, and for that they used the engaging leadership model, which those of you who've heard of Real World Route before will know that this is our sort of flagship approach to leadership, and which we are continually revalidating, including at the moment, as I mentioned just now, in terms of hybrid working. But it's basically a way of leaders understanding whether they are, for want of a better phrase, doing the right thing in relation to maximising the potential of their teams, influencing the wider culture, leading across boundaries, truly influencing in the system as individuals to the right level. And critically, at the core, are they seen to be acting in line with the critical values that make people want to follow you or not? And as you'll know if you've known of us before, this is all based on very strong evidence. So then the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was then what was the actual facilitation that was used in this programme. So the facilitation in this programme was, as I said before, it was about feeding back the findings to those two groups or those two teams separately, but facilitating it in a way that enables them to interpret the data rather than telling them what it says. And when you approach these kind of programs, this is really, really critical. So if you're going to replicate this in your own way, then one of the things to be bearing in mind is that it's really important to get that buy-in at the beginning. It's really important that individuals share their individual perspectives before you collate it into a whole, so that you genuinely get individuals buy-in. And at a team level, it's really, really important as well that whatever data you're presenting the team with, you're not sort of presenting it as a done deal. It's like, well, this is what we need to act on then, because this is the lowest rated. Now, the lowest rated item in an assessment is not necessarily the key priority. Like I said before, it's all about context. So the way we fed it back was about enabling it to be then taken or interpreted in the context of the team and the challenges at that particular time, in the context of the bigger BVN. We then supported CLT develop and SLT develop on their own, and then to come together and share their learning between themselves about how that would enable their better working together. And it was partly about creating space for more psychological safety. And of course, I'm sure I think it's okay for me to say that Runnymede was moving from quite a paternalistic approach to leadership to trying to empower and create a greater culture of empowerment throughout the organisation. And that needed to start from CLT and working differently with SLT and beyond. And of course, individual leaders were provided with coaching support rather than being left to to just find their own way. And then finally, and I'm just going to go through this really quickly, I talked about this survey before. The whole organisation were invited to complete this. They were asked about their line manager and about senior leaders and the impact leaders are having on their positive attitudes to work and their well-being at work. And I've explained that it's about a deep dive into leadership culture. But what we know about the things that are being assessed in this survey is that they're not just critical for the kind of things that the BVN mentioned, just generally in a digital age and in a really fast-paced world in which we've got to engage everybody. We've got to make sure that we're being truly inclusive and embracing, people and their capabilities and their potential. It assesses all those things that relate to that evidence shows make the biggest difference. And again, it was tailored to Runnymede vision and challenges. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through things, but hopefully that gives you a good sense of the kind of methodology that you need to approach if you want to replicate something like this. So I'll hand back over now to Kate to talk about success achieved.
Thanks, Juliette. If we can pull up all of the bullet points, if that's okay. Thank you so much. So during the course of the year, The chief executive, Andrew Pritchard, was new to the organisation. He'd only joined in the preceding summer of when we got the BVN. We had 2 relatively new assistant chief executives as well. So the very senior, what we call CLT leadership in the organisation was very, very new. So this was a really challenging time for the whole organisation, including the political leadership, as well as our workforce, to have a completely new leadership team come in at the officer level. And with that, it brought about quite a diametric change. As Juliette said, we had quite a paternalistic style of leadership, quite a heroic leader in the past, in our previous chief executive who'd been with us for 15 years. And that had worked and led Runnymede to be seen as really quite forward-thinking within Surrey in the work that it had been doing, and brave in some of its decisions around expansion of the property portfolio. And then you were forward 15 years and life's different. Austerity measures are harder, and our previous chief executive retired and Andrew started. So when with all of that challenge, plus the BVN, the key thing for us was to really look strategically, as I said, at how we could get an understanding of where we were and what both the political leadership thought of CLT and SLT and what the workforce thought of the organisation as a whole. And that's where the outcomes of these 3 kind of key pieces of work helped us to reassure our MHCLG colleagues and also be able to develop a whole action plan of continuous improvement to be able to target those areas that we wanted to do more work in, to actually support the capacity and capability of the whole organisation to continue to go on and deliver and show that we weren't resting on our laurels and we were continuing to challenge ourselves to improve best value for our communities. So all of the work that we put in place was very much around addressing the results from the My Experience Matters survey and looking at what the workforce was telling us and linking that back, as you do, with a "you said we did." So please don't think that I've come along and talked to you today thinking that I've got a silver bullet and I know more than anyone else in the room, because that's not the case. We just did what we thought was right based on what the feedback told us and what our workforce and our partners and our political leadership thought the gaps were. And that's what was really, really important. And that's what MHCLG and the corporate peer challenge thought was really quite refreshing, was that we had this check and challenge on who we were, how we were behaving, and therefore what we were doing about it. The corporate peer challenge said that they were pleased to see that the councils used the BVN as an opportunity to self-reflect and invite scrutiny. And I think these key processes really, really assisted us in doing that. When we came to meet with various colleagues from the monthly meetings with MHCLG and also with the CPC reviewers, we were confident that both how we were perceived as senior managers and how we were behaving would be articulated in the way that our workforce were then saying we did actually behave, because we had done this work and we had those insights. And this gave us, for the first time, an evidence-based approach on how we were going to move forward and do some of the work to address some of the gaps. Can we change slides, Juliette? Is that possible? When we were doing some of these things, some of it was some of the stuff that colleagues have done up and down the country already. So one of the real gaps that we had was around in some very, very basic elements. There were feedback from our workforce that actually senior management credited staff with the work that they did, and that was seen as understood, but there wasn't an element of personal thank you. And that wasn't the grand gestures, that wasn't, you know, pay rises, it wasn't awards ceremonies, it was a simple thank you so much for what you've done this week. I can see how that's moved us from A to B. It was about senior managers being seen by the workforce as their colleagues and members of the team, and that they were in this together with them and not aloof from them. That actually was one of the things that colleagues had fed back, and they've done a lot of work to make sure that they're more visible and part of their team in responding to that. So part of it, in terms of the external scrutiny and the check and challenge, was really to help inform what that continuous improvement plan was going to look like. We were prepared to have ideas and systems and suggestions from everybody across the organisation, and that actually those in denial wouldn't be left in denial, if that was so to speak, and that the mirror was well and truly held up. And there was quite a lot when we did the 360, both team and individual. There were quite a lot of personal reflections with CLT and SLT on how they had their leadership and behavioural styles maybe needed to be amended and altered to engage better with certain parts of the organisation in order to increase performance, increase motivation, and deliver on some of the things that we needed to turn around. We did more work to build on collaboration across the senior leadership team and not solely rely on people in their silos. And that work continues because, you know, we were fortunate in that we had in December 24 our BVN lifted, but that doesn't mean to say that everything is perfect and this shouldn't continue. So we're continuing to collaborate on a combined action plan from the My Experience Matters surveys and making sure that that addresses the issues that came out of the gaps that we'd identified from using the 360 feedback with the senior leadership team. So we're looking at where people didn't feel that the senior leadership team were as engaging or as supportive or as grateful for the work that they were doing, and building that in to the responses that go alongside the My Experience Matters survey action plan. And as Juliette said, we've been using the appreciative inquiry tools and techniques in order to have a kind of positive approach to problem solve around some of the areas that we need to do more on. So that collaboration has been really, really key. We didn't sit in an ivory tower and write the action plan in blissful isolation. We've actually developed it through the feedback from the appreciative inquiry work streams. Now, there are a lot of actions that were obvious, which we have put in, but definitely we're using the feedback from the appreciative inquiry sessions on the solutions and the ideas to help us do that. We also took an approach to opening up things like savings and efficiency suggestions across the organisation and had a whole staff-led campaign about what that could look like and how that did workshops to generate ideas on things that could be addressed. That came down to some rather wacky ideas of charging people to use parks, or alternatively, very simple solutions that actually many of them saved 10 to 50,000 pounds, and then ultimately, if you look after the pennies, the pounds take care of themselves. So, but the key to it was that the workforce felt that they were being listened to, and we comprehensively went through every single suggestion and fed back where it is in the triage process, who it was being considered by, how it could be supported, what was considered, if it couldn't be, why it couldn't be. And those people got a personal email back to recognise that their contribution had been considered or taken forward. So there were some really good things that came out of the feedback in terms of CLT and SLT about being more open, more transparent, not dealing with things solely on their own, sharing some of the challenges, inviting, we're a small council, 460 heads are clearly better than 8. So it makes a difference as to what one can see and what your perspective is, and therefore how you can contribute to the solutions. Could we go to the next slide, Juliette? Okay. Thank you. So in terms of, we're continuing to use the support of colleagues utilise the support of all colleagues through local government reorganisation. We're continuing our continuous improvement programme right up to vesting day, and using the opportunity really to look at how we can align and improve as much of the organisation ahead of vesting day, so that the new unitary, whatever shape and form that takes, is in the very best possible place to function. So there's a real key thing here about it's not about just doing what we want now, it's about actually doing what is best for the communities ongoing for the future, and making sure that we align the continuous improvement work to pick up that, because change continues to be vast and ever a fast pace. We're continuing to look at the leadership development work with the support and facilitation of the Real World Group. And we're going to be resurveying the culture and leadership survey across the workforce later this year, so that we can compare and contrast to see what we've actually put in place and whether or not we've improved in the areas that they thought they could either only slightly agree or disagreed with when they answered the statements within that culture and leadership survey, and to see if actually we've bridged the gap in terms of gaining greater support, collaboration and performance from colleagues in order to help us on this journey. So we've seen some small steps, the launch of a Belong at Runnymede programme to embrace kind of EDI and well-being as a diametrically slice of the organisation, to contribute to doing things like that, as well as having feedback from staff that actually in some areas the interventions and the support that we've put in place at the senior leadership team level, they are seeing actually improve their teams functioning at a very operational level. And some of those things have been really quite pleasing to see in what has been a relatively short period of time, to try and be able to demonstrate that not only we understand ourselves, but we're also doing something to improve the areas that require it. So at that point, I'll stop. And I think it's really over to colleagues in the audience. If you have any questions, thoughts, challenges, we'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Thank you both. It's a really kind of thorough but concise explanation of a really interesting journey at pace. And I think that's one of the key points. There's just one set of comments in the chat, which I'll just pick up first. So John was asking effectively, what is the best value notice? And I know that Kirsty's put a link in there, but it just might be worth, just in this context of commissioners, envoys, best value notices, maybe just giving a little summary of a voluntary best value notice.
So best value notice is your first intervention applied by government to when they have a concern about your organisation. And as I said at the beginning, for colleagues who were able to join right at the start, the concern that they had with Runnymede was our debt to loan ratio. We embraced commercialisation 10 to 15 years ago, bought a lot of property and borrowed money to do so. And that does have a real benefit for Runnymede. We generate 11 to 13 million pounds annually to spend on discretionary services that otherwise we wouldn't be able to provide. But it does come with some level of risk. And that's what government were really, really concerned about. And our ability, capability and capacity to be able to manage that across the organisation, from the very political senior leaders down to frontline officers. Does that help answer your question, John?
Okay, I think it does, looking at John's message in the chat. And just one from Deborah. It's an interesting one. Was there anything that came out of the work that you weren't expecting? Insights, reactions from staff, reactions from leadership? I think that's a really good, interesting question.
I think initially, because Runnymede had already been seen as quite forward thinking, it was a little bit of a shock in terms of what do you mean? You know, this is a concern. We're managing it admirably and it's all fine. And actually, you know, the CPC review and the outcome from the best value notice does confirm that those things were managed well and continue to be managed well. I must say that it was about 5 to 7 years ago that there was a decision not to buy any more property, and we already had an assets disposal process underway and in training that we could demonstrate. But I think the key thing was also being able to demonstrate to the MCHLG that we were still able to meet the savings that we had committed to within the organisation. And I think that was a real challenge for the organisation, because where you constantly are trying to reduce and salami slice, that takes a much more strategic approach to thinking about how you're actually going to deliver the savings. So the idea around generating staff ideas around savings and efficiencies and really engaging in that process was really, really key to being able to reassure CPC and MHCLG that we were doing a route to branch approach to this, and it wasn't just at a strategic level that they'd made, you know, godlike decisions for the future of everything without involving the people that actually work with the communities and frontline services. And I think initially that was something that CLT thought, well, we are the SMEs of those areas. We should be able to make these decisions. But they quickly understood why actually the power of 460 brains rather than 8 to 12 brains would actually enhance the whole continuous improvement programme and contribute to that. And not only is it about them coming up with ideas and solutions, but it's actually the feeling of being engaged in the process and therefore part of the solution that increases people's commitment and performance, which we could demonstrate when the CPC came in and talked to everybody.
That's helpful, Kate. I think just actually there's no other questions in the chat at the moment, so just quickly building on that point, and I recognise there's lots of other factors that can influence turnover, not least the fact that, you know, going into local government reorganisation, which creates its own uncertainties. But has this kind of best value notice and the work that's done, albeit really positive, has it created any churn and turnover, or have you managed to build on your existing group?
No, we've built on our existing group. We didn't, due to the BVM, we didn't lose anybody at corporate leadership team level or senior leadership team level, which was really, really fortunate. Everybody lent into the process and kind of owned it, which was really, really good. And really, I think through the facilitation work that we did around the Group 360, came together to really think about, as a group, what can we do? Not as a head of planning or as a head of customer and digital, what can I do? It's very much around thinking about, as a group, what can we do collectively and how can we approach this from a collective perspective. And I think that where the service review programme has been looking at, you know, the service as a whole and therefore multi-departmental teams looking at it from a multidisciplinary approach and how services can be improved from that perspective actually really, really helps to aid the future and contribute to the savings, thus bringing down the concerns that were initially had about were we capable and can we competently deliver the savings that we've promised. The key challenge for us is to continue to do that for this year, and with 4 million to save, it continues to be a challenge for us here in Runnymede, being a small district council.
And I guess that's one of the relevant points, that although the, you know, that intense work on culture with Juliette and colleagues has been done, that the best value notice has been lifted, actually that journey then continues, doesn't it? So it doesn't stop. There's more, always more to do.
Always, because even when you have your notice lifted, you continue to have a quarterly meeting with MHCLG.
Yeah.
If they had cause for concern, if they thought we weren't actually achieving the savings that we'd identified, that we said we could achieve, they would, I'm sure, have no qualms in, coming back in and looking at us again. And I think that's the challenge, and it's particularly challenging for Surrey. Our neighbours, two of our neighbours, have commissioners in terms of Speltham Borough Council and Woking Borough Council, and devolution and local government reorganisation is going to be interesting for us over the next 6 months, whilst we wait the outcome of how they deem our future.
Nice safe word, interesting. Excellent. I've got no more questions in the chat. I'll just do one last invitation for anybody who wants to perhaps ask a killer question that hasn't already been asked. If not, I think perhaps we'll draw it to a close. But can I just say, really grateful for your presentations, your insights, for sharing the journey. And I think whether or not we have commissioners in, we have best value notices or not, there's lots that we can all learn from this. So very grateful.
You're more than welcome. And if anybody is in that position and would like to get in touch, please don't hesitate to do so.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Brilliant. And thanks everybody for joining. Have a good Friday.